Network USA. We're going to go ahead and get started. As you can see, everyone has been typing in the chat box where they're joining us from. It's great to see that there's so much interaction and participation throughout the US, so we're really excited for that. Next slide. I'm going to go ahead and just go over do a quick run through of the platform that we're using today and just some of the features that you'll be able to use, and also just get through some housekeeping. So first of all, we are recording today's webinar, and we will make this recording available to you all in the next week or so. So if you registered, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording as well as other resources that we mentioned throughout today. We know that due to the current situation with COVID-19, many of us may be working from new or different environments, that may be working from home or somewhere where there may not be as much privacy. So we just want to acknowledge that. We also want to ask for your patience with technology. We know that a lot of people are trying to access the platform, and everyone, it seems to be relying on the webinar platforms these days. So if you have any trouble hearing us or any of the presenters, if you could just let us know in the chat box, that's the best way to let us know. Again, you'll see that chat box, and if you click on everyone, then we can all see that. You're also encouraged to ask questions, to add resources or comments throughout the presentation. We know that there's a lot of great expertise within the attendees, so we definitely want to hear what you all find useful, what you all have found successful in your community as it relates to today's topics. Within your screen, you will notice that you have a number of features to interact throughout the webinar. And so the first one, if you're already hearing my voice, you don't need this, but just make sure that your speaker button on the top of your screen is in green to hear audio from your computer. Everyone is automatically muted, so no worries about that there. You also have a raise hand feature in case we ask questions and you want to just give us an answer through raising your hand. That's available for you. There you will find a list of attendees on your right side as well as presenters, and then you'll see your chat box with the presenters and attendees, which you can interact with us. We have not been able to get our closed captioning pod working, but we do have a link that we're going to go ahead and drop in the chat box now. And if you click on that, it will give you that closed captioning just in a different tab, but you'll have that available for you. So go ahead and just make sure that you get familiar with all of those features, and then we can go ahead and start on the presentation. Next slide. And so today's presentation is being brought to you by the Freedom Network Training and Technical Assistance Project on Housing. As part of this project, we focus on housing for survivors of trafficking, and that includes a lot of interacting and intersecting topics, and also with allied fields. We do web-based trainings every other month. We have a resource library, and we do technical assistance. And so if you are also, I saw a chat that some people are not getting audio. Again, we're going to go ahead and type in that chat box how to click on your audio and make sure you have that highlighted in green. But also, if you have other technical issues throughout today's webinar, I'm going to go ahead and put in our email address, so that way you can email us directly, and our colleague Amanda will be assisting you all. So just let us know if there's any other technical issues that you all run into. And again, we're just going to ask you for your patience, as I'm sure that a lot of people may be trying to get on and trying to access the platforms. And as I was saying, with this project, we're very much intentional in making sure that we are partnering with colleagues across sectors, across allied fields, because we know that human trafficking intersects with multiple populations and demographics, and we want to have a thoughtful and a collaborative approach to our response. Next slide. Today's speakers are, we're just so excited to be able to have both Brian and Jess on. And so I just want to give you a little background on both. Brian, pronouns he, him, is a licensed social worker in New York. He has nearly a decade of experience working with survivors of crime, including human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, as well as childhood abuse. Brian is currently the supervising social worker for the anti-trafficking program at Safe Horizon, which is the largest victim services provider in New York City. He also works in private practice in Midtown Manhattan, where he provides trauma-focused psychotherapy and general talk therapy. Jess Torres, pronouns they, them, is a queer migrant born in El Salvador and raised in New York City. They are an advocate in the anti-trafficking movement and a survivor leadership program coordinator at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, which is also known as CAST. Jess serves as the co-chair of the National Survivor Network, which organizes a collective of over 250 human trafficking survivors, as well as a Los Angeles group called Resilient Voices. Jess is also a 2019 Women's Policy Institute Fellow and has successfully helped pass their human trafficking initiative in the state of California. So again, we're so grateful to be able to have both Brian and Jess, and we know that they're going to bring a lot to today's conversation, and we encourage you again to ask questions throughout today. Let's go ahead and have the next slide. And it sounds like some people are hearing some static. Can you just, in the chat box, can you let me know if you can hear me okay, or if you're getting static, just so we know how to best address it? Okay, it sounds like some people are hearing it okay, some here are hearing an echo. Okay, so most seems like it's okay. Some people are getting a little bit of a choppy audio. Go ahead and email us if your audio is not functioning well. It may be, again, internet connection. So we're just going to go ahead and try and have some patience with today's technology. So for today, we really hope that this webinar will be useful to you all. We are focusing on giving housing providers who either are already working with survivors or who are interested in working with survivors a foundation on human trafficking. So this is very much an introduction, and we know that human trafficking can cover a lot of things. There's a lot of aspects to it, but we hope that it will lay that foundation in learning about the labor and sex trafficking aspects. We also want you to learn about the needs of survivors, especially as they relate to housing and human trafficking. And we want you to hear and learn about how you can best collaborate with anti-trafficking programs in your local community. Next slide. And we're actually going to be doing a poll because we want to get a sense of what you're already doing. So what kind of trafficking, sorry, this is actually not the right poll. We want to get to know if you're serving survivors of trafficking. So thank you. We kind of jumped early on the other one. So the first question, you already know what the next question is going to be, but the first question is, are you already serving survivors of trafficking in your housing program? And so let us know, yes, if you know you're already serving survivors. No, if you're not, you may not be sure. That's fine. Just let us know. And we'll go ahead and give you a minute, and then we'll go ahead and show those results for everyone. So we'll give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, also in the chat box, lots of yeses, some not sure, some no. Okay, great. A lot of don't knows. Good. Okay, let's go ahead and show those results. Okay, so we're gonna see, and hopefully people can see the results. Can people see the results? Let's see, sounds like people can. No, oh no, sorry. Okay, so again, sorry, technology might not be our friend today. We're gonna go ahead and try to show them, but I'll go ahead and just let you know what they are. So we have the majority of participants, about 56% are saying yes, they are already serving survivors within their housing program. About almost 20% are saying no, and about 23% are saying they're not sure. So we know that there are, okay, now people can see it. Great. Perfect. So this is really useful for us to know. We know that there is a mix of attendees and participants. And also this is very similar to what we see on the ground with different programs. We know that some people may be already serving survivors within a housing program, especially if you're not an anti-trafficking program. You may very well already be serving survivors whether you know it or not. Not everyone self-identifies, and so as you'll hear from today's presentation, you may already be serving them, but even if you're not and you're interested, we definitely encourage you to ask us questions and also to be able to take away from today's webinar some ways that you can, again, connect with your anti-trafficking providers, so that way we can make sure that survivors of trafficking have access to housing. Next slide. Great. So we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian, and he's going to get us started.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. And again, if anyone has any issues hearing or anything like that, please just say so. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to make individuals perform certain services like commercial sex acts, as well as labor trafficking. And we will get into what those two mean, so it sounds like some people are having no audio, but there will be a recording as well. So again, it's the use of force, fraud, or coercion, which we will get into in a little while. But something that I really want to point out is that anyone under the age of 18 who has been engaged in any commercial sex acts is considered a human trafficking victim. So it looks like there's some difficulty hearing for some people. Perhaps I can try speaking from here, but again, for some people can hear, some people cannot, but there will be audio later. And so again, anyone under the age of 18 engaged in any commercial sex, by federal law, is considered to be a victim of human trafficking. And again, we will get into what that means later. Next slide, please. So there are three pieces to defining human trafficking under federal law. And the federal law, is called the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, this AMP model definitely helps illustrate the federal definition of human trafficking. At a minimum, one component of each piece, so one in action, one in means, one in purpose, must be present for human trafficking to exist. Under federal law, and again, I'm going to keep repeating this over and over because many people serve minors as well in shelter, and minors, again, under the age of 18, they do not need to prove that they were forced, defrauded, or coerced into having commercial sex acts. So to break down what the definition means a bit more, action, again, includes inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, essentially the actions the trafficker takes. The second is the means, which we just went into a bit, but force means physical abuse, sexual abuse, forcefully compelling someone to engage in the trafficking. Defrauding someone could mean that they are being told that they will receive a green card or work permit upon their entry into the United States, and that by working or by engaging in certain activities that they will receive that green card once they are finished. Coercing someone may be telling them or convincing them that they need the trafficker more than anything, that they need the trafficker to pay for their rent because they are unable to, because they perhaps need medication that the victim does not have access to, and that the trafficker is the only person that they convince them that they can help with getting some of these medications. The purpose for sex trafficking, in the end, is for commercial sex acts or for labor trafficking. So, for example, a young man can be promised a teaching job by a family friend, but he finds out he's not getting paid, and he actually will be working in the fields. He is not paid, and he is told he is now in debt and must work to pay off his trip as well as the rent he is accruing. So he was promised a job, he was defrauded, and he was told that he would be doing a teaching job, and yet he is now actually working in the fields. So he was recruited to work. He was defrauded as to the actual job that he will be doing, and the purpose is for labor trafficking, and that he is now in debt, he must work to pay off the trip, and he is also accruing rent by being forced to live in the housing for the fields. Next slide, please. This is a very, very common myth that we hear from many people. So, human trafficking can include, but it does not require movement. And so a person can experience trafficking no matter if they are a U.S. citizen, if they were initially applying for a job, like the previous example, they were promised a teaching job, and now they are now working in the fields, or they could have participated in a crime. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more. So participating in a crime, that does often happen. In the context of sex trafficking, oftentimes the trafficker will force a victim to recruit other forms of other victims as well into sex trafficking. In terms of labor trafficking, sometimes we have heard of individuals who have used false documents to sometimes individuals will force trafficking victims to use documents that are not their own to potentially enter the country, to attain false employment, or other forms of fraud that a victim may be compelled to do by their trafficker. And I also really want to highlight that the trafficking victim can be anyone. I think that oftentimes there is a myth that the person that they think of as a trafficking victim is someone who is potentially from a foreign country, who may not speak English, who may come from an impoverished background. And although those things can sometimes be true, we see a variety of victims, from U.S. citizens to individuals who are here on a valid visa, whether that's a tourist visa, an education visa, a work visa, or those who are out of status, so those who maybe entered the country under false documents, like what we were discussing before, or they are people who are U.S. citizens, and they, again, come from more vulnerable backgrounds, and we will get into some of that vulnerability a bit later as well. But again, I want to highlight that there is a spectrum of what we would think of as a victim of human trafficking. Next slide, please. So again, a very important slide, because I think that oftentimes this is another myth, in that people will use the terms trafficking and smuggling interchangeably. And again, so with trafficking, we're looking for the three major elements of force, fraud, or coercion, again, unless a minor is engaged in commercial sex. Human trafficking also involves a crime or a violation against another person. And that crime or violation, of course, includes all of the types of scenarios that we were previously discussing. And trafficked persons are more often than not seen as victims by the law. I say more often than not because sometimes reality can not necessarily align with what the best case scenario always is. And then with smuggling, again, we have the term voluntary on there, but I want to make sure that we highlight that typically individuals who are being smuggled are coming from backgrounds where there is a significant amount of poverty, where there's a significant amount of a lack of education, and potentially, and more often than not, previous instances of victimizations. So, although smuggling is a voluntary act, it's important to consider that the situations that are drawing people to be smuggled into the country do include backgrounds that people did not choose. And so smuggling is paying someone to bring them into the country, and a common word that many people may have heard through the news media would be a coyote. So coyote, for those of you that may not have heard that, is someone who is paid to bring someone across the border, typically from Mexico into the United States. We certainly see smuggling in many, many different forms, and smuggling across the border from Mexico to the United States is certainly the most sensationalized type of smuggling, but we see it in many, many different types of ways as well that people will pay to get to the United States. Also important to mention is that although these are two very distinct terms, smuggling can sometimes lead to trafficking. So someone may have paid a coyote $5,000 to cross the border, but then that smuggling, the same person that they paid may then force them into sex trafficking, which we've certainly seen before. So they are two distinct terms, but one can become the other. Smuggling can become human trafficking. Next slide, please. So, the different types of human trafficking. So we received this data from the International Labor Organization in 2016, and so I want to bring your attention to the left side of the slide, where we are looking at the three different sections of a pie chart, where it says state-imposed forced labor, forced sexual exploitation, and forced labor exploitation. And so we are, several years ahead, but I think that these numbers are still fairly accurate. And also keep in mind that these are global numbers. These are not numbers within the United States, but the United States is certainly included in this data set. So I like to point out in particular the state-imposed forced labor and what that means. So the state-imposed forced labor more often includes prisoners working for pennies per hour. We see this, of course, here in the United States, as well as globally in many other countries. I think that a common example that many people may think of would be North Korea, where state-imposed forced labor is a piece of state-imposed forced labor is a part of their regime. There's also forced sexual exploitation, and again, this can come in many, many different forms. Trafficking is also included, and again, forced labor exploitation takes up the biggest piece of that pie chart. Forced labor exploitation can include many, many different areas of our life, from restaurant work to agriculture to car work, many different service industries, hotel work. So if you consider all of these different industries where people are being labor trafficked globally, the number is more likely much higher than 16 million people. And again, this data set is a bit out of, we're a few years out from it, but those are still pretty significant numbers. On the right side of the slide, we have our gender distributions in human trafficking. So with labor trafficking, we more often see somewhat of a split, male and female. Within our own program at Safe Horizon, the anti-trafficking program, we also see a pretty steady mix as well. We have been seeing a number of male labor trafficking survivors as well, but again, it is fairly split. Sex trafficking sex trafficking typically is female identified dominated, but we have to keep in mind a number of factors. The biggest one being that many people underreport. Many people may not even understand that they are being trafficked in the first place. Keep in mind that the federal law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is not that old. It's about 20 years old, which in the grand scheme of laws in the United States, that is a very, very new crime. And so we have here that 99% of females were, that 99% of reported sex trafficking victims were females. But again, we know that with reporting, particularly with men, particularly with young men of color, that reporting tends to be significantly lower than other types of victims. And so it's important to keep in mind that sex trafficking is not just a female-identified crime. It's a crime that affects everyone. It's a crime that affects all genders, it affects all races, it affects all sexual orientations. And so it's just important to remember that we have biases around many of these things, but we certainly need to be more aware of many different people going through these experiences. So I want to open up I'm sorry, I think that we're supposed to do a poll in a previous slide, but I think that this is also a good way for us to tie it in. So if everyone could answer, what kind of trafficking are you seeing? And then I'll let you all go for a minute, and then we will broadcast the results. Not surprisingly, as we're seeing right now, that labor trafficking is so far the lowest recorded type of trafficking that people are seeing. That I think is certainly reflective of a lot of different. I think that many people are aware of what labor trafficking might look like. But again, so far we're only seeing 5 people who have seen labor trafficking in their settings. Of course, sex trafficking is a big one. Sex and labor trafficking, I think that's very interesting, that many people are seeing both. We'll give people a few more moments. If you could just submit your poll, this is helpful for us to kind of know. We're broadcasting the results now. Okay, so it looks like we might be just about finished with polling. Some people are still going. So yeah, very interesting. Labor trafficking, again, we're not too surprised, right, that is the lower number that we see. Labor trafficking, again, is very much underreported. And quite frankly, even for someone who works in the field and who is doing human trafficking related work, it can sometimes be very difficult to still spot labor trafficking and understanding the difference between labor trafficking and labor exploitation, which again can be another conversation if you all tune in for, I'm sure, more Freedom Network trainings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so again, this is a study, or this is a Department of Justice provides grants and money to various human trafficking programs to provide human trafficking services. And so the breakdown here, this data set is from July 1st, 2017 until June 30th, 2018. And many of this is also included in the TIP report. And the TIP report is put out by the Department of State, by the United States, and it's the Trafficking in Persons report. Every year they put out a report that explains each country's rating for how they are tackling human trafficking in their country. And so I highly recommend that you all check it out. It's a very, 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 very long document, but it does include every country that in the report. And it includes a breakdown of what is happening in that country that they are doing to support survivors of sex and labor trafficking. And just to highlight a few pieces here, again, we're seeing that sex trafficking is one of the more common, is certainly the more common by a stretch, the types of trafficking that we are seeing. And again, to highlight the grantees, so many people are, there are many programs who receive money again, and the number 8,913 open trafficking cases, again, that is an extremely low number. This is, this is a federal, these are federal numbers, so we know that 8,900 people, that is certainly well below the number of people, the number of survivors who are in the United States alone. So I think that there's still a lot of work to do. And there's, certainly many of them are also living in the shelter system. And for many reasons, they perhaps are living in the shelter system. Sometimes they're being identified, sometimes they're not. But it is important to recognize that, again, we have many more people who are victims of sex, labor, or both types of trafficking amongst us. And so, again, I want to also point out that 72% of the open cases that they have are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. So again, kind of going against what the stereotype is of a trafficking victim being undocumented or not having any type of status. And so, again, it's a very important number that many people that are actually being trafficked are people who have legal residence of some form in the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few myths and misconceptions. We don't have it written out because there's quite a few, and we already kind of went over several in the past few slides. One of them, of course, being that human trafficking and smuggling are one and the same. But the other is that many people oftentimes think that human trafficking begins very young, so perhaps as a teenager, or preteen, or 12 to 14 years old. However, we often see that although traumatic experiences may certainly have happened around that time that have led them into trafficking, and trafficking most certainly happens in that age range, trafficking happens across a spectrum. We have, within our own program, we have clients ranging from preteen all the way into 60s and 70s. And so, although the trafficking may have either happened many years ago, or the trafficking is still happening to this day, we see a wide age range of those who are being sex trafficked. Another myth that I think that some may hold is that human trafficking and sex work are the same thing, which they are not. Human trafficking, again, requires several elements, including force, fraud, or coercion. And sex work, for many people, is voluntary. So sex work, for some people, again, this can be very complicated. In New York State, there are two competing bills, essentially. One in which
Brian, I believe your audio went out. Yeah, it seems like, yeah, we may have lost the audio. So give us just a couple moments. We're going to go ahead and see if we can get Brian. Thank you. Yeah, we know that the audio went out for Brian, so we're going to go ahead and try and troubleshoot that quickly, and then we should be able to get him back on. So give us one moment. Thank you for being patient. We know that there are a lot of challenges, especially with webinars, but we are really grateful that you all are here and that you all are helping us add to this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and while we get Brian back on, it seems like there were some questions around some of the misconceptions in some of specifically the stats around age that Brian was addressing. And so I'll just kind of review a couple of those and expand on them. And so there's a myth or a commonly cited statistic that the average age of entry into human trafficking is 12 to 14 years old. And so, unfortunately, this statistic may falsely lead people to assume that only children are trafficked or that all survivors of trafficking may have started in childhood. But we know that people can be trafficked at any time in their life, young or older. And this statistics has actually been attributed to a number of different sources. However, the original source has never actually been verified. So the actual statistic has not been really proven in any way. And also an additional problem or challenge is that this is based on the average entry based on that study into commercial sex. So it does not attribute or count anybody who experienced labor trafficking. And also people can be trafficked multiple times within their lifetime. So we just want to make sure that we address that, knowing that trafficking can impact a number of different groups and populations and throughout different times in a lifetime. So we just want to make sure that we're not perpetuating that information. And it seems like there may be some audio challenges. Again, probably if you're hearing me, then that may not be you. But we're going to go ahead and put in the chat box a couple of times just so people can log back in. Unfortunately, a lot of the lag both in audio and in the visuals may have to do with the connectivity of each individual. So we don't have a lot of control over that, but we're trying to work through it on our end. All right, and it looks like we may have Brian back, so I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let him continue his. All right, Brian, if you can go ahead and click on your mic, I think you might need to activate it. Sorry, I may have spoken a little prematurely. We have Brian back, but it seems like his mic might not have started yet. Okay, and I'm not sure if Brian is able to get his mic back up. So we'll give it just one more minute, and if we can't get Brian's audio back on, we'll go ahead and move forward, and then hopefully we can get him back towards the end of the presentation, and he can wrap up the section that he was talking on. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the section from Jess, and they'll take us through their section. And then once we're able to get Brian, we'll come back. And so once Brian comes back, we'll be talking about who is trafficked and who are the traffickers, and diving a little further into that. We'll talk about what makes a person vulnerable to trafficking, what are some of the signs of potential signs of somebody who is being trafficked, and also around trauma-informed services. So we'll go ahead and move forward. If we can do the next slide. And let's just go ahead and move on to Jess's section. And again, we'll come back to this section. So we'll come back and address the remaining slides. Jess, we'll go ahead and.
Great, thank you, Karen. Can you hear me? Just checking. Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone again for your patience and for your participation. We really appreciate each and every one of you. I'm going to jump right in and start talking about the intersections of housing, homelessness, and human trafficking. So what we're seeing before us is a 2018 research project brought to us by Polaris. It's called On-Ramps, Intersections, and Exit Routes. And in this research project, 127 survivors were surveyed, and 64% of the respondents reported being homeless or experiencing unstable housing when they were recruited. So again, when they were recruited. Which means that for many survivors, experiencing homelessness or that housing instability was a massive vulnerability and a potential on-ramp, or what we call like a push-pull factor. Similarly, from January 2015 to December 2017, the National Human Trafficking Hotline learned of 1,548 potential victims experiencing unstable housing at the start of that trafficking situation. So keeping in mind that these numbers are from survivors who self-reported, who knew or suspected that they were being trafficked, and who are aware of that hotline as a resource. So what this number is not capturing is that those who are homeless because of their trafficking situation, or those folks who were trafficked in their youth and who are or were still vulnerable because of their personal and social vulnerabilities. So examples of this would be their immigration status, perhaps disability, poverty, or their sexual identity or gender expression. They're still vulnerable because of those personal and social vulnerabilities, and they also doesn't capture those whom are still affected by these adverse childhood experiences, or those who were recruited at the shelter itself or a group home. So next slide. So again, stakeholders across the housing systems all have a role to play in preventing and responding to trafficking. The National Survivor Network hosted a call with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and survivors from across the country expressed that their barriers to housing stretched across the housing spectrum. So it wasn't just specific to one type of housing. So for example, landlords and property managers and rental companies, they wouldn't rent to the survivors for various reasons, like criminal records, no credit or bad credit, lack of employment history. Echo. Are you all hearing that? Okay, so because also of their, or also sometimes just because of their knowledge of their survivor status, and that made them uneasy about renting. And other times there were situations where folks would not let a survivor like break a lease in an emergency, or in the case of public housing, would not respond or even rehouse because of a crisis level situation. So that all speaks to us about lack of education on the issue. And also, like, certain housing providers deemed human trafficking survivors like too high risk or high maintenance to take on. For labor trafficking survivors, men, trans folks who are all survivors, we know that shelter is limited or non-existent, and many organizations and agencies are also limited in their definition of interpersonal violence, and therefore not able or willing to serve HT victims. So some of the solutions we can offer for this is adapting those definitions or policies to include all interpersonal violence, and also because it's very likely that we are already serving human trafficking survivors. So if we can expand our knowledge, our cultural sensitivity, our understanding to like further integrate human trafficking survivors and provide those comprehensive services and best practices, that would be another possible solution. Advocating for the survivors who are often left out of the typical human trafficking narrative. So, advocating for some of those demographics that I stated before, like men and trans folks, maybe advocating for more affordable housing units in general, or in the case of public housing, creating crisis response teams and educating the tenants about those crisis response teams, or high-risk public housing rehousing coordination. So, next slide. Oops, thank you. Also, you know what? Can I go back to the last slide? I had 2 other points. Another thing that we can do as a possible solution is to offer trainings to providers and staff on the stages of change, and perhaps adapting our policies or requirements. So what does that mean? For example, like not rejecting survivors with substance abuse issues, because we know that substance abuse and numbing is integrated and sometimes or oftentimes heavily managed by the trafficker. So instead of not rejecting them or kicking them out, considering partnering with local substance abuse disorder treatment programs, or maybe reconsidering how maybe our programming mirrors the power dynamics survivors were subjected to during their trafficking situation. And again, always leaving it up to the discretion of the survivor to disclose their survivor status, like not forcing them to participate in group counseling in order to be at the facility, because we understand that and this is again all about adapting our services, because we understand that if the group is not human trafficking specific, the experience can sometimes be of like disclosing those things or speaking about your situation, or maybe trying to hide your situation can feel isolating or stigmatizing by the fellow residents because the experience is not shared. So 2 examples I can offer of that are, I knew a survivor who was a labor trafficking survivor who was in a domestic violence shelter, and oftentimes it was a shelter that you could bring your kids to when you were fleeing a domestic violence situation. So this labor trafficking survivor had no kids, and she was often accosted because of that. She was told, like, why are you even here? You're taking up the space of someone who actually needs to be here and who needs to bring their kids here. When she was escaping a domestic servitude situation that she had been in for over 10 years. I know another trans survivor who was at a domestic violence shelter, but the women who were there were not comfortable with her gender identity or expression, and were not welcoming, so they discriminated against her because she was trans. So again, in those cases, are we creating restorative or transformative justice-based consequences for violence? Are we modeling how to use someone's pronouns? Are we correcting folks who are misgendering someone? And are we offering just an understanding about human trafficking in general, so that folks understand that interpersonal violence doesn't look just one way. And as far as the point about ensuring access to safe and affordable housing, because that allows survivors the space to thrive, we also know that ensuring access to supportive, stable, and affordable housing also allows survivors a space of community and support and uplift. So again, even though we are often interacting with survivors at a crisis response level, sorry, my computer keeps turning off. My apologies. So even though we're often seeing survivors at that crisis response level or at transitional housing or reentry. Our ultimate goal is and should be long-term sustainable housing and extended recovery. So knowing that that's our ultimate end goal. And another tip for this is that I recently learned about is landlord whispering. So a term I just learned, which really just means providing housing advocacy and maybe educating other housing providers or offering more money as a security deposit in case there's any uneasiness by a landlord who might feel some type of way about renting to a survivor. So those are all suggestions, but obviously we could talk about many, many, many more. So let's just move on to the next slide. All right. So as far as how to best work with survivors of human trafficking, I believe that begins with learning how to be a good ally. So this definition of ally recognizes that being a good ally means constantly working alongside the community that you are allying yourself to, which sometimes means stepping up and sometimes means stepping back. So these are some tips on how to be a good ally. The first one is acknowledging your privilege. So some examples of this are like, what is your definition of success? And once we know that, we can think about whether or not we are projecting that definition onto our client. And the reason that is important is because, for example, a friend of mine works very intimately with the Skid Row community. And I heard her say once, even if we procured like 100,000 beds tomorrow, the majority of folks would not go. So why is this, right? So when we think about this through a trauma-informed lens, that is, it could be many times because of the impact of trauma on your self-worth, the impact of trauma on your self-esteem, and then the compacted issues of things like mental illness or chronic homelessness, for example. So again, realizing that folks, have become accustomed to this life, and that we can't blame them for this. This is literally how they survived, is by becoming accustomed to it. And it's also not that they don't want to get out of the situation. It's that they literally don't know how and don't believe that they deserve better. So this person often works with the Skid Row community to just make their situation on the street a bit easier, and that again then reflects to them that they're capable of more and that people care. So something to also keep in mind is that for a lot of folks, human trafficking is the culmination of the trauma experience. So they have been abused, not all folks, but for many of the survivors that I have met, I would say the majority, they have been abused for years. So the situation, abuse is normalized. And the situation, the human trafficking situation that they're in now is normalized because of this prior trauma, or because of intergenerational trauma, or because of the need for survival. So even like being put on a track can become so normalized, just an average ordinary day, and like what you're expected to do for that day. So also, we know that folks experiencing interpersonal violence often don't want the relationship to end. They just want the abuse to stop. So folks go back because they hope, like anyone picking up a cigarette after a long, long time of recovery, that it will just be different this time, or it'll just be it was just that one time, that sort of hope. And another way to think about this is that, like, if a person loses their ability to walk, we don't say to them, it's clear that you don't want to walk anymore. We take them to physical therapy and we move one limb at a time, and then until that person relearns how to relive a new normal. So again, oftentimes I've heard folks say, like, such and such person or such and such survivor won't take a $10 job, or they don't want help, right? And what we're not, if we're looking at that through a trauma-informed lens, and understanding that or just having the consideration about what it might have been like to see like $1,000 a night or $5K a week, and then go to a $10 job and then not be able to afford anything. Like, what might money mean to someone to a person who came from poverty? Might that mean making it or something like that? So no matter, so for example, in my youth, I learned from an early age that my value and safety was linked to how desirable I was to men, and I was sexualized from a very, very, very early age. So again, escaping one situation and feeling like I was finding refuge in another, and obviously the sexual abuse being completely normalized for a very long time. So even something, for example, when we talk about privilege, like I've heard people say like they won't take the bus, and so like or just like something as simple as helping someone fill out a form and not assuming that they don't want to do it, but showing them the basic life skills, because it may not be that easy for someone who is new to the U.S. or doesn't speak English, for example. And again, never assuming that someone doesn't want help. So the second point is about listening to the community. So survivors have the right to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, just like all of us do. And impacted people know what's best, like the best ways to meet their needs, and they also know what their unmet needs are. So we should definitely be listening more than we are talking. As far as learning and unlearning, we are all guilty of stereotyping at some point in our lives, and we are all conditioned by our environments. So we often have to unlearn, or I should say learn from one another to and reflect on what these biases are and sort of deconstruct those biases, and learn that truth from one another. Initiate those tough conversations can often help us to unlearn and to learn. And again, educating those around us, and of course, getting involved. So that can mean so many different things. It can mean getting involved politically. That can mean getting involved within our organizations or with our families, and in general, just supporting survivors at every stage of their lives by sharing resources or sponsoring that empowerment or uplift to some degree. And again, ally is a verb and not a noun, which means it's something you do, not something you are necessarily. Next slide. So these are some of the social services needs of survivors. As you can see, there is a broad spectrum of services on this slide. So I can't stress the importance of collaboration enough. Like, us as housing providers, we will not be able to meet all of these needs because we're housing providers. So who are we working with? Mental health providers, parenting or doula services. Are we? I know in New York City that was like a part of an agency, like a city agency that like this doula program existed, which was really great. So like, how are we being creative about our case planning? Are we connecting folks to like pantry or food distribution if food insecurity is something that they need? Are we connecting them to legal services and providers, HIV services or rehab facilities, re-entry orgs? Sometimes, we can help with housing, but we can direct, certain communities like LGBT to LGBT organizations or rape crisis or human rights coalitions, or or harm reduction organizations. So again, stressing collaboration and stressing sort of the need to know our role and not feel the need to take on everything because we have a very specific and important role. Next slide. Alrighty, so let's move on to client-centered care, often called survivor-centered, victim-centered, empowerment-centered, all essentially referring to the same thing, which means just honoring the self-determination and agency of a person and a client. And another highlight would be like the the collaboration with that client. So co-constructed plans based on discussion and informed compromise. And the last piece about how to practice harm reduction, this is really important with folks experiencing homelessness, but also specifically for human trafficking survivors who are experiencing housing instability. When we talk about harm reduction, we're talking about a model of support and treatment or an approach that addresses risky behavior, and the focus being to minimize harm that may come from that risky behavior, which can sometimes almost feel like a willingness to tolerate the engagement in the behavior, but that's because we recognize that that person has autonomy and free will and that only they can decide what's best for them, and that only they can essentially save themselves, right? So this is, if we're implementing that empowerment-centered engagement, our role as a support is really just, engaging in dialogue and demonstrating the willingness to explore what risks are present, and helping a person determine the benefits and risks of that behavior so they can manage that risk. And again, this approach doesn't require abstinence. Like, it doesn't require abstinence from the behavior for engagement or for support. So normalizing why a person may benefit from the behavior and how it is serving them, and then this sort of makes space to look at the issue and think critically about it. And sometimes that can lead to folks being reveling, like, about the situation. It can mean folks being reluctant. It can mean, seeing a little bit of rebellion. It can mean folks resigning to, like, I honestly don't think I can do this, and it can lead to rationalizing the behavior. But, we're doing this because we're creating space to look at that issue, if to even evaluate if it's a problem, because you can't change something you don't think is a problem. Next slide. So how can housing providers implement trauma-informed services? At the level of engagement, we have to be providing safety, physical and emotional safety. So that can mean safety in community, safety in that neighborhood, and safety in the service relationship. And that sort of that safety is created by trust. So the trustworthiness takes time, and it should, because we shouldn't just trust someone we just met. Oftentimes that's what gets us into bad situations. So, it can be a rough road before this is fully achieved, but, trust is proven over time, and we have to make sure, even, sometimes we don't have that time with a survivor, but understanding that, if we see them again, it's not like, oh, here you are again. It's, you have to develop that trust that in the service, and also in your ability to be able to do it. And in that person who's offering that help. So next point is choice and collaboration, which we've touched on many times, and again, the empowerment in every facet. So at the level of approach, we definitely want to make sure that our services do no additional harm. This is like a huge, huge, huge thing. If nothing else, we don't want to add to the situation, right? And we can also do that by breaking goals down into manageable steps and celebrating small victories, which is a very strength-based approach. Next slide. So this leads me to empathy. So are we aware of how our questions or body language or our tone can create judgment, stigmatization, or shame? Are we staying attuned to our personal needs? So are we not taking things personally? Are we advocating for supportive supervision and a space to process, your frustration or compassion fatigue or burnout? Are we rolling with the resistance that a client is giving us? Because, you know, we're processing that ambivalence. Change is hard. Like, how many of us have had a New Year's resolution and, you know, conquered it every time? I would say that most of us, that's not the case. And that's because change is hard, and it takes time. So empowering folks, again, to see their worthiness and rolling with that resistance. Another, you know, as far as approach, we have to keep an open mind and be compassionate. And also, again, just creating that support system for yourself, because the folks we're seeing are often, they're tough to deal with. And so we need to make sure that we're offering compassion and understanding and support. And we can't offer that unless we are taking care of ourselves. I believe is that it? Are we?
Yes. Thank you so much, Jess. We're going to go ahead and head back just a little bit to pick up where Brian had left off. And so we're going to go ahead and let him take over for the next few slides.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, everyone. You know, some internet connections working from home, but hopefully we should be good for the rest of the presentation. So who is trafficked and who is the trafficker? More often than not, we see that many of the survivors that we are working with are undocumented. They may be coming from working in migrant or field work. In New York, we don't typically see as much of the migrant or field work population, but we certainly do see many people in the service industry, the restaurant industry, hotels, massage parlors, things like that. More often than not, too, we see many young women of color, trans women of color as well, who are being sex trafficked, as well as labor trafficked. Again, like I mentioned way back when, trafficking really can happen to anyone across all genders, across all orientations, and across all races. Traffickers can be anyone as well. Frequently identified people who traffic, we very often see intimate partners being the ones who are trafficking individuals, particularly for sex trafficking. We see family members. Here in New York, we often do hear of many people being trafficked by diplomats. We have people who've been trafficked for domestic work, cleaning the diplomat's agency, the diplomat's home, and that is quite common here in New York. And so we also see this happen for traffickers to be people who are making, who are recruiting individuals for employment. So it really can be anyone, you know, not to scare people, right, to say that a trafficker can be anyone, but that we certainly can recognize that intimate partners, family members, they are potential individuals as well who do engage in this. And I saw someone ask earlier, or mention earlier, that domestic violence, that there's a lot of overlap with domestic violence and human trafficking. And we will get into that in just a minute. But I did want to address that because it's very true that many of the things that you all are seeing are overlaps with other victimizations, particularly with intimate partnerships. Intimate partnerships on both sides, on domestic violence and with sex trafficking, are very, very similar dynamics. And so very often when we are assessing someone for sex trafficking, we are also assessing them for domestic violence because, as we're discussing here, shelters can sometimes be a bit more difficult to come across for certain types of victims of trafficking. And so we're really trying to also look, in addition to the trafficking, if that resource isn't available, what else has happened in their life, or what has happened concurrently with the trafficking that we can also support them with various resources. Next slide, please. So what makes a person vulnerable to trafficking? I really want to highlight just a couple of them. Of course, there are many different vulnerabilities that individuals experience. Economic hardship is certainly one of them. economic hardship is particularly important for foreign national survivors, so those who are coming from another country. Many times we see individuals coming from poverty, food insecurity, lack of employment, a lack of education, and these are vulnerabilities that would induce someone to engage in acts that they may not necessarily agree with, or acts that they are unsure that is criminal activity to begin with. And so economic hardship, I think, is one of the most important factors in a trafficking victim's background. A history of violence and abuse. And again, this is very similar for many other victimizations, that one victimization, particularly in childhood or early life, may lead to future victimizations like human trafficking or sexual assault. And so when meeting with someone who you believe to be a victim of human trafficking, it's also very important to assess their prior trauma history as well, because that may also have a huge impact on their current situation and being a victim of trafficking.
Brian, I think we may have lost your audio. If y'all will give us just 1 minute, it seems like maybe the audio went out for Brian. 1 second.
I think I'm back. The internet is really, really tough. So we are back. So I'm going to try and speed this up to get to questions. And again, to go back to this slide again, so we also see many runaway and homeless youth. This can also be a vulnerability in someone's past that, again, is leading them to trafficking. And I want to highlight particularly for runaway and homeless youth that oftentimes they may be engaging in commercial sex that, again, in their minds may not have to do with trafficking, but they're engaging in commercial sex acts as a means of survival. Perhaps they were kicked out of their home for being gay or lesbian, for being transgender, and that individual is now needing to engage in survival sex. Although that is considered sex trafficking under federal law, we can also see concurrently that survival sex is a necessary means for certain individuals, particularly for runaway and homeless youth. Next slide, please. Okay, and so these are some additional warning signs, you could call them, to look for when meeting with survivors of human trafficking. And again, I like that someone much earlier in the chat box had mentioned that there are a lot of similarities to domestic violence, and many of them are. So the one on the slide that I particularly want to highlight is survivors being coached on what to say and how to communicate. We've seen this several times, and there's an example that I have of someone who was being sex trafficked by her boyfriend and was even being supported in going to therapy and doctor's appointments, but when she would go to these appointments or to the emergency room for help from either physical assault from the trafficker or other injuries sustained during the trafficking, we have seen often that trafficker coached the victim on what to say to the doctor and what to say to their therapist. And so as crazy as it might sound to some people, there are many victims who are being seen by doctors and professionals who may either not recognize that they're being trafficked or the person was coached on what to say, which again is pretty similar to domestic violence, right, where many domestic violence victims are also being coached on what to say if they're presenting to the emergency room with injuries. And so that can be a big warning sign. Another major warning sign that we often see is no access to identity documents or money. It's very common for survivors to have their passports or other identifications stolen during a trafficking experience. And so when we hear that their passport was stolen, that their visa was stolen, that they were told that they would never get it back if they ever left, that to us is a warning sign that potentially they were being trafficked. And again, showing signs of abuse, that can look different in a lot of different ways, right? We understand the physical signs. We may understand some of the emotional signs. So maybe being withdrawn. I just want to I want to highlight the fact that there is no standard emotion. There is no standard sign necessarily of abuse. It really can present in different ways. So oftentimes as service providers, I think that we have to be very creative in the way that we ask questions, because abuse isn't always going to appear as a bruise on the face or something as visible as that. Sometimes many of these signs of abuse are going to be very much internal. And so I think it's important for us to think broadly about what are all the different types of abuse that someone can experience. Next slide, please. So, like Jess was saying in their slides before around trauma-informed care, client-centered practices. So trauma-informed services, I see this as viewing the client before you through a trauma lens, meaning we're not labeling what they're experiencing as behavioral issues, quote-unquote, or acting out or anything like that, but rather reactions. So we view, at least at Safe Horizon, the way that we view many of our survivors, regardless of the victimization, is that they have trauma reactions as a result of experiencing an extremely difficult experience. And so many of these reactions can include having intrusive thoughts, images, memories, difficulty concentrating, feeling like you're being watched or feeling watchful or on guard. So someone who maybe is frequently looking at the door, someone who's frequently checking their cell phone, even in a meeting, and someone, or I've seen many people look extremely nervous when they look at their cell phone, they look at me, they look at their cell phone. And so asking questions, very much open-ended questions, right? You never want to ask why. You never want to ask, something closed-ended or something that, maybe service-oriented. But if you really want to get to, the heart of what a survivor is experiencing, open-ended questions in this setting is the way to go. Survivors benefit the most from comprehensive services. So wraparound care like counseling, medical care, housing, right, which is what we're discussing today, and benefits assistance. These are all extremely important things. For our undocumented clients, having a legal component as well. At the anti-trafficking program where I work, we have a multidisciplinary team of lawyers, social workers, trainers. Our senior director is involved in a lot of policy work. So collaboration is really key. And of course, confidentiality and privacy are extremely critical. And to make a point about the previous slide around traffickers having a lot of control and coaching survivors on what to say, it's important to keep in mind that with that, confidentiality and privacy may be compromised if the trafficker is heavily engaged in the survivor services. So best practices that we say is that we always want to speak to the person by themselves. If they're calling us, we want to make sure that they are in a safe place, that they are perhaps speaking alone. Okay. And, right, so I just went out for just another minute, which is okay. So next slide, please. Then we will be just about finished. And we can get to questions. So, what can you do? This is the big question that everyone asks. If you are with someone and you don't know whether they are a victim of human trafficking, you're not sure where to refer them, you're not sure about anything. You can always either Google, search for your local anti-trafficking organization. Sometimes they are fewer and farther between. Or finding one on freedomnetworkusa.org. Freedom Network is a national organization, and so they have resources for many different parts of the country. And they also have been sending out the resources list through the chat, which they may be sending out again as well, and also with the PowerPoint. And also they just sent out the number list. You can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is the number that's found here, or the survivor has the option to text help or info to the number on the screen. And again, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a really wonderful resource. They're 24 hours, and they connect survivors to their local resources, and they also provide technical assistance to providers if you are unsure if the person who is sitting in front of you is a victim of trafficking, or you need additional assistance in assessing for their trafficking eligibility. So I think that is it for me for now. And next slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brian and Jess. That was really fantastic. And thank you all for hanging in there with, I know that the audio has been a little choppy, but we appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and move into questions. We know that there were a number of questions that came in through the registration, but also throughout today's presentation. So we'll go ahead and get started on those. We will start with a question that we got in the registration, and this one will be for Jess. So why do victims go back to their perpetrators after they're home safe again, or they have access to safe?
Case by case, but one of the things that I can offer is that most of the time it's related to a trauma bond, which can occur as a result of these ongoing cycles of abuse, which reinforce that, like a reward based system. So oftentimes people tend to seek attachments in the face of danger. So that trauma bond is sort of like a dysfunctional attachment that occurs in that presence of danger, as we said before, because of that cycle of abuse. You know, trauma bonds can involve like misplaced loyalty or the inability to detach from someone, self kind of destructive denial, oftentimes captivity, if someone's held in captivity, that can also sort of like mess with your ability to understand who is the protector and who is the, for lack of a better word, rescuer, even though we know that like survivors rescue themselves, but the help, the support. So not really knowing the difference between those two things, really thinking like this person takes care of me and they took care of me in a time and place where nobody else would take care of me. So I don't care what you have to say about that person, or you don't know like my life, you don't know what I've been through, and you don't know like, and essentially choosing this as the lesser of the evils for so many different reasons that we talked about before, because of lack of self-worth, because of lack of self-esteem, and also sometimes because of the absence of outside support. So trauma bonding.
Great, thank you, Jess. The next question is for Brian, and it is, where do you get the most accurate statistics on human trafficking?
So, well, I mentioned to you all earlier the TIP report that the Department of State puts out, and I think that at some point in the chat the link to it was also sent out. But that includes a lot of information on not only the United States, but also other countries, well, really every country in the world, where you can see what each country's rating is, and you can also see the prevalence of human trafficking within each country. So I think that that's probably the best, that's one of the best resources to get the most up-to-date information, because the TIP report comes out each year. So I recommend going there to find it, or Yeah, so they just resent it again, and again, that's the State Department, and that's the 2019 report. And so again, they come out with that every year, which has really great information on each country's status of serving human trafficking victims.
Thank you, Brian. The next question is for Jess. It is, how do you report or how do you support individuals who are still engaged in trafficking while they're in shelter, but do not want to speak to authorities or law enforcement?
So I would say the best thing to do is to not contact the authorities. I think we stressed a couple of times the importance of choice and collaboration. I think that sometimes if there's no choice in the sense that the law enforcement is already involved, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to manage. But if that person does not want to speak to the authorities, we essentially should not force them to, because it's putting that survivor at risk. That survivor, and it's putting other people at risk. Oftentimes, people are living under threat, and those threats can be very real. So, I know where your mom lives, I know where your brother goes to school, or maybe escalating a situation to the point of like putting that survivor at risk for things like, murder. So like we have to really listen to what that person is saying, because sometimes it's fear-based, but oftentimes it can be reality. And so again, meeting that client where they're at, and working with them to stabilize. And once they're stable, things can change. But we really have to take the survivor client's lead on that.
Thank you, Jess. The next question is from the chat box. It asks, what are the most common obstacles you find when advocating for a client with landlords? So we'll go ahead and have Brian take this question.
The first thing that popped into mind for me was actually a client's immigration status, because their immigration status is connected to a lot of different areas of their life, including employment. So when we have a client who's at risk of being evicted, who hasn't been paying their rent, and we're trying to advocate with the landlord, we have to be very careful about what we are saying to the landlord around status, around employment, and it's extremely critical that we try to find the balance between advocacy and sharing too much information. So I think that to me, the biggest obstacle that we find is around that. In New York City, the biggest obstacle that we have when advocating for a client with any type of housing, even landlords, is cost of living. That's probably New York City's biggest challenge of the millennia is overpriced housing, and so I think that is one of the most difficult obstacles that we have when even placing clients in any type of housing.
Thank you, Brian. And then one question that came in earlier, and I'm going to have Jess take this one, is around, are transgendered individuals who are survivors or victims of trafficking being put into housing according to the sex that they identify with? So Jess, what have you seen around that?
So unfortunately, I've seen that sometimes this is not the case, but like the advice I can offer around that is that we, in one of the slides that we presented, it said that, as far as the approach, we want to make sure that we are providing services that cause no additional harm. And if you are, that person is essentially, rejected and isolated because of their very true, very real identity. And so putting them in a shelter that doesn't affirm their gender identity is causing further harm. So if we are, abiding by those core values, then we most certainly need to. And I have seen, for example, CAS has an emergency shelter that serves all women identified survivors and non-binary folks. So there are services and there are shelters that are, understanding and sort of trained on, the importance of that for the trans population, because otherwise folks won't stay in services very long, and it makes it an unsafe place to exist as you are. So oftentimes they won't even take the housing because it's the threat of violence, and because it doesn't make you feel good for someone, just thinking about it and as a cisgendered person, like if you tell someone you're a woman and they say no, you're a man, that would feel horrific. And so it's very similar. So we want to make sure that we are respecting people's pronouns and identities as much as the systems will allow us to.
Great, thank you, Jess. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide because unfortunately we are at time. We do want to continue this conversation. We know that there is a lot more to unpack here, so please know that we will have additional webinars coming your way. We will be sharing today's slide deck as well as the recording and the resources that were mentioned in a follow-up email in about a week or so. But please keep in touch with us. We have a resource library where you can find additional webinars and materials. You can email us at training@freedomnetworkusa.org with any questions that you have, and we're happy to connect you with any materials that would be useful. We want to again thank you for your participation and your patience with technology today. There will be a post-evaluation. We would love to get your feedback. We know that there are definitely areas that you all are hoping to get out of these webinars, so we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs and your expectations. So please go ahead and give us some feedback. And definitely, we know that technology was a challenge today, so again, we want to thank you for your patience. And please look out for additional webinar opportunities that will be happening in the very near future. We hope that you're staying safe, and please connect with us as we can help give you more information and resources. Thank you, and we'll be talking soon.